Hi, welcome to the lectures on animal ethics for bioethics in 2020. My name's Gemma. I am a postgraduate student in history and philosophy of science. I've been a student of Dominic's, and also I'm a student of Hans Pol's. So usually I give this lecture and I make it quite interactive, but because this is pre-recorded, of course, we won't be able to do that. But you're welcome to contact me via email or organise a time to chat with me about these things. I'm very passionate about animal ethics, and particularly animal ethics in the context of science. So before I launch into my lecture proper, I'll just give you a little bit of background to me so you know why I might be interested in these things. My research at the moment is in the history of psychiatry and the philosophy of psychiatry. I've been working in philosophy of psychiatry for quite some time now, and I've done a lot of work on addiction, and now I'm working on all sorts of things to do with the history of psychiatry in Australia. But before that, I worked as a human geographer and I did an environmental science degree, and I've been an animal activist for a very long time. And it was studying with Peter Singer and being an animal and environmental activist that really took me into university. And this is what motivates me and I'm passionate about. So hopefully you'll gain something from these two lectures. I want to say from the outset, although I have very strong personal views on animal ethics, what I'm going to present is actually more of a moderate view. I'm going to try and balance out things as much as I can. And you'll find that even when I'm doing that, I do err on the side of something needs to change. But hopefully you can enter into these two lectures with an open mind, and hopefully I'll be able to clearly outline why you should care about non-human animals. And so just a note on terminology before I start. I usually use the term non-human animals rather than just say animals, because I think it separates us less. I think there's something interesting about the fact that we are comfortable saying other beings are animals, but not putting ourselves in that category. And obviously we are animals. So I just say animals, meaning inclusive of humans, or non-human animals if I'm meaning exclusive from humans. So I'll just share my screen and then we can go from there. Okay, so first of all, I thought I would start with some lovely pictures of happy animals because there will be some pictures that are not so happy throughout, but I've peppered them with things that are happy. These are actually all rescued animals that have been rescued from scientific research. So they've all been used in laboratories and then had some freedom granted to them. Okay, so far in this course, you've covered ethics, mostly in relation to humans. And look, there's a very good reason for that. Being humans, we're naturally more concerned with our own species rather than other species. But in this lecture, I want to explore other species because there's actually no particular reason why we should restrict our ethical considerations in such a way, like on the lines of species. And the main conclusions that you might have come to so far in the context of biomedical research is that scientific inquiry shouldn't be completely unfettered. We can't just do whatever we like to do or whatever we on a whim think we want to do, etc. There are limits to research. And some of these these limits rather are technical, but some of them are ethical. So science has ethical limits which apply to the nature of research and what the process of research does to others. Now, of course, research on humans is the most obvious place in which these ethical limits are understood, but that's not the only ethical limit to the process of research. And so what I want to think about today is whether the interests of non-human animals serve as a limit to scientific inquiry. And I'm going to say that they do. But how far you want to take that becomes the next question. And I want to then think and ask, are there any specific ethical considerations related to non-human animals, and think about how they're the same or different to the sorts of considerations we have for humans. So to begin with, I'll just give you a brief background as to what kind of research is done in Australia and how much it relies on animals, non-human animals. So in Australia, the number of animals used for research has actually jumped. In the last few years, it's more than doubled. And in 2015, it was around the 10 million mark. And by 2017, we're talking more like an estimate of 21 million animals, non-human animals, have been used in research. You can get more information about those, although I'll actually show you a couple of tables, but the Humane Research Australia statistics, that's where the most reliable numbers on these things are. It is difficult to get these numbers, particularly as some states are not as good as other states in actually tracking that. In Australia, we do have a number of ethical frameworks, which is used for non-human animals in research and teaching. These operate at a federal and a state level, but there are also codes of practice at individual institutions or research groups. And Sydney University has their own standards for the use of non-human animals in research. So this is a very detailed slide. It's really just for your own benefit later. It's a breakdown of the statistics per state, like which states are using what non-human animals and in what numbers. The numbers for places like South Australia are actually not on this. South Australia and ACT, the numbers for 2017 weren't available. So the 21 million is an estimate based on projections from 2015, plus these real numbers for all the other states. Now, in terms of the kinds of policies and regulations that are in place for the use of non-human animals in scientific research, they're very varied, and they vary across national borders in particular. There are no global agreements on the use of non-human animals in research, and so it's very inconsistent. There's some consistency across Australia, but once you extend it further than that, there's really very little consistency. The one thing I would say that is consistent is that generally the focus is on animal welfare rather than animal rights. And what does that mean? It means the laws and the regulations are about how we use animals, so their housing, what they're fed, what we're allowed or not allowed to do to them, rather than non-human animal rights, as in that they have some kind of intrinsic worth or intrinsic needs which we have some kind of obligation to meet. There are some places where there is an exception to that, where animal rights are recognised. For instance, the German and Swiss constitutions have recently installed rights for animals, and I believe New Zealand has also done that fairly recently. And there are sort of wide-scale bans on certain things. So like Europe has banned the sale of animal-tested cosmetic products. In Australia, we've banned the testing of cosmetic products on non-human animals, but we haven't banned the sale of products which have been tested on animals, which means that we can import stuff that actually has had that process happen. Now, what are animals used for? Well, non-human animals are used right across the board for a whole bunch of different kinds of testing. The most obvious and most known are things like product testing, and non-human animals are used to test cosmetics, to test cleaning products, pesticides, cigarettes, and so forth. Of course, they're also used in medical experimentation to test pharmaceuticals, to test surgery techniques, to develop transgenic mutations. I'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. And to develop treatments for diseases and pathogens. In fact, I read an article this morning in which it said rather proudly that monkeys were being used in Thailand right now to test COVID-19 vaccines. They're also used in a bunch of other things. So they're also used in basic research. And what we mean by basic research is things like understanding physiology or psychology and biology. And a lot of that is just behavioral studies, but they could be put in stressful environments. Some of the worst stuff comes from psychology. Biology is usually observational, and they're used in the development of genetic engineering. They're also used in military testing. And one of the readings I gave you today, the Peter Singer reading, does cover some of that, and it's quite confronting. Non-human animals are used to test weapons. They use live animals and test weapons on them. They're also used in space research and psychological testing. And as you can imagine, if you're thinking about military testing, that's psychological testing, that's going to be quite extreme. But also non-human animals are used in teaching. Large numbers of non-human animals are used in teaching. If you've done any biology in first year, you would have had to do some dissections unless you opposed to that and stated your opposition, which is what I did when I was in first year. But generally speaking, first year students do use non-human animals, and especially when you progress through, if you're in medical sciences or veterinary science, that makes sense. They use them to practice surgical techniques. Another category, which I really won't talk about today, but you feel free to ask me about it at a later time, is that large numbers of non-human animals are of course used in agriculture and food production. And you may or may not agree with that. Okay, so this is just for your information again. This is a breakdown of what kinds of things we have used non-human animals for in Australia specifically. You can see, look, a fair bit of it, very large numbers are used in environmental studies. That's different, that's quite observational. Or for stock breeding and stock maintenance, that's agriculture. And this kind of basic research, not a very large number used for the production of biological products and so on in Australia, but that doesn't carry across the world. A lot of non-human animals are used for that stuff elsewhere. Okay, so what are non-human animals subjected to? Apologies if you're a bit squeamish. Okay, vivisection doesn't happen much in Australia, but it happens elsewhere. Vivisection is surgery conducted on a living creature for the purposes of experimentation. Now, we do this a little bit in agricultural research, but generally it's frowned upon in Australia for good reason, because sometimes they keep the animal conscious while this happens. So while they're having surgery done on them, or sometimes they're unconscious. It's a bit traumatic in many ways for the non-human animal. As I said, some research is observational. This is mostly in basic research. When it comes to product testing and cosmetic testing and pharmaceutical testing, the kinds of things that we do are irritancy and toxicity tests, such as the Drey's eyes test or the LD50 test. LD50 is a standard which says how much of some kind of product do we have to give this group of non-human animals in order for 50% of them to die. That's what the LD50 test is. Repeated dose toxicity, skin corrosivity, etc. We infect non-human animals with diseases and infections, and then we test medical treatments on them. As I said, psychological, military, and space research. There's a lot of stuff that's done in addiction research, stress responses, etc. And there's also genetic engineering, which is a growing area. And I will talk a bit about xenotransplantation tomorrow, or in the next lecture rather. Okay, here is the breakdown of the numbers for Australia. You can see actually there's a very large number of non-human animals which are used in genetic engineering. But a lot of things, look, the vast majority or the largest number is actually observational studies involving minor interference. And that makes sense. We've got a very large amount of basic research in biology and environmental science and ecology that doesn't involve any, like, actually engaging with non-human animals in any kind of disruptive way. And that counts as non-human animal research, but it's probably the least ethically problematic, if ethically problematic at all. Okay, so on the other end of the scale, of course, there's lots of awful things that we do to animals, and this is just some of the actually this is some of the kinder practices of science in this context. If you are interested, and I do warn you, the images can be really quite confronting. You can look up these things to see what we're doing across the world. But yes, just a fair warning, it could be quite confronting. Now, you might remember earlier in the year, it feels like forever ago, but it was only just earlier in the year, in February, some baboons escaped from the RPA near us, and they were actually being used for research which was associated with Sydney University, research on preeclampsia, the pregnancy related disorder, and heart disease. And yes, we engage in primate research. And the baboons escaping and being next to the hospital, at first the media reports and the press releases were saying, oh no, they were just there because of XYZ, something about, you know, the baboon was getting a vasectomy and that's why he was there, and he just needed his female companions with him. And everyone kind of thought, no, that's a bit sus. And actually, after talking to people at the who work at the hospital, I was able to surmise that they actually were using them for research on those things that I just mentioned. And there was a bit of a kind of explosion in the media after this came to light, and a real discussion about transparency in animal medical research and the idea that we should be more open in science about what we're doing and about why we're doing it, because a lot of people do, in fact, have problems with this kind of research. So this is where we enter into the ethics of non-human animals being used in science. And I'm going to go through it very methodically, and then you can come to your conclusions from there. All right, so this is the general question. Scientific research on primates or anything, what do we owe animals? And you might want to start with, what do we owe animals like us? I mean, that was the main problem that people had with the baboons. You can read that later if you like. All right. What do we need to do in order to systematically approach this question of what kind of moral status non-human animals have? Well, we have to think in terms of what makes something have a moral status. To say that a being deserves moral consideration is to say that there is a moral claim that being has on anyone who can recognize such a claim. And we as humans can, generally speaking, not all of us, but the majority of us can recognize moral claims, right? So a being that has a has moral consideration is a being that can be wronged in a morally relevant sense, right? So we need to work out whether non-human animals have any of these claims. Now, it's generally thought that actually only humans can make such claims, because it's only humans that can respond to such claims, right? We can only be wronged because we can feel that we can be wronged, but also we can do good to others, right? It's a kind of two-way street. But the problem with that view is that it discounts large numbers of humans who are unable to do that. We're talking about children, people with severe intellectual disabilities, and also the infirm, the elderly infirm, or anybody who, for whatever reason, can't actually have this, back and forth, right? So humans are just members of a species. We have to ask, is there any reason why we should care about all humans and then stop and not care about non-human animals? Now, we could just look to the law, right? Non-human animals are, in Australia at least, not granted personhood status. So you've talked a lot about personhood so far. They're not granted that. But as you've discussed, we ethically, we think about certain groups of humans as still requiring moral consideration, even though they can't confer that to others. And we do that because there's certain kinds of capacities, perhaps, that are morally relevant. Now, in these claims, we have a lot of grey areas, and we have to think about whether non-human animals are in fact morally distinct from humans. So to do that, we can approach it methodically, and we can ask, what capacities mark out all and only humans as the kind of beings that can be wronged, right? Okay, so let's have some suggestions to that. These are some of the ones that have been suggested over time as things that are really distinctly human, that separate us from other species. Developing family ties, solving social problems, expressing emotions, starting wars, having sex for pleasure, using language, or thinking abstractly. Now, are these in fact unique to humans? The quick answer is no, they're not. And in fact, we have all sorts of behavior across the non-human animal kingdom that matches each one of those. There's non-human animals that do all of those things. For instance, several species grieve, right? We kind of think of grief as something that only humans can do because they only have this kind of strong family tie stuff going on. But elephants grieve, so do monkeys, primates, they grieve. Meerkats in the Kalahari Desert are known to sacrifice their own safety by staying with sick or injured family members so that the fatally ill will not die alone. Lots of primates live in socially complex groupings. They have family ties, and that they have social structures that involve solving social problems, and they learn to maneuver them. Animals develop lifelong bonds and are known to suffer terribly at the death of their partners. This is true of birds in particular. Some are even said to die of sorrow. That is true of birds. But it's also true of monkeys, and we've known this for a very long time. This is a quote from Darwin, in The Descent of Man. And he's saying, so intense is the grief of female monkeys for the loss of their young that invariably cause the death of certain kinds. And, it doesn't take much for people to sort of start seeing this kind of cognition or something like what we're doing in other non-human animals, the expression of emotions, starting wars. That does actually happen in certain monkey groups, and I believe in dog groups. Having sex for pleasure, but bonobos do that all the time. Using language, primates do that, chickens have language, etc. Thinking abstractly, primates and parrots, corvids, lots of stuff like that, right? So none of these is actually unique to humans. So can we grant then non-human animals, or at least some non-human animals, personhood status? Well, it depends who you ask. Now, if you were to ask a Kantian, they may not actually think that you could. And here's a quote from Kant himself. It's every rational being exists as an end in himself and not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will. Beings whose existence depends not on our will, but on nature have, nevertheless, if they are not rational beings, only a relative value as means and are therefore called things. On the other hand, rational beings are called persons inasmuch as their nature already marks themselves out as ends in themselves. And what he's doing here, and he does this in other parts of his work, he's specifically placing non-human animals in a category of things, whereas persons, and it is only rational beings, so this does actually restrict certain groups of humans. Persons are in this separate category that deserves a kind of different moral status. At another point, he says, the fact that the human being can have the representation I raises him infinitely above all the other beings on earth. By this, he is a person, obviously it's gendered because it's a bit older, that is, a being altogether different in rank and dignity from things, such as irrational animals, with one which may deal and dispose of at one's discretion. So he basically said, you can do what you like to non-human animals, they're not persons. Now, is that correct? Well, look, the short answer is no. This is a surprisingly controversial area of philosophy and science, this consciousness thing. So Kant is saying that human beings have a consciousness. They have the ability to say I, they know who they are. So if we then look at non-human animals and see if this is possible, if they actually do have an understanding of I, which may look different than our understanding of I, but still is, then we have a problem for this view, this Kantian view, that separates non-human animals and humans in this way. And the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness is probably the turning point in philosophy for this, and I've included a link for it. It was written in 2012, and it was written and signed by eminent neuroscientists. So this is not necessarily philosophers, but neuroscientists who looked at the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, right? So they were trying to work out if non-human animals have the capacity for conscious states. And they said, yes, non-human animals do have that capacity and the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. And they further argued that humans were not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. So non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. Now, octopuses is an interesting category. If you have a fascination for octopuses, which I do, you might already know this, but the way in which neurons are distributed across the arms of the octopus means that their consciousness and their way of being in the world is so different to ours. And for a long time, we thought that they didn't have consciousness, but now we know that it is a different type of consciousness which has evolved completely separately to ours, which is so cool. But that does have ramifications for the kinds of things that we think are acceptable to do to octopuses, because they are in fact, experiencing consciousness. So some could argue, and it could be argued, that this didn't go far enough. Like, for instance, there's evidence that fish possess conscious states. And I've included here an article from New Scientist that discusses some of the omissions and some of the conclusions of the declaration. And there's also here the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry, which is a little bit older now, but it outlines the philosophical debate on consciousness. For now, we're really interested in this question. What ramifications do statements and research such as this have for scientific inquiry? Okay, so this is a quote from Christine Korsgaard, who's actually a deontologist as well. And she argues that humans uniquely face a problem. And they face this problem of normativity. And this only arises because of the reflective structure of human consciousness. We can, and we often do, think about our desires and ask ourselves, are these desires reasons for action? So we have this kind of reflexive nature. We ask, do these impulses represent the kinds of things I want to act according to? And because of this kind of reflective capacity and this requirement for us to step back, she sees this as separate from non-human animals. So when we determine whether we should take a particular desire as a reason to act, we're engaging in a further level of reflection, that a level that requires an endorsable description of ourselves. She calls this the practical identity. And I have this quote from her. It says, a lower animal's attention is fixed on the world. Its perception, its beliefs, and its desires are its will. It is engaged in conscious activities, but it is not conscious of them. That is, they are not the objects of its attention. But we human animals turn our attention to our perceptions and desires themselves, onto our own mental activities. We are conscious of them. That's why we can think about them. And this sets us a problem that no other animal has. It is the problem of the normative. The reflective mind cannot settle for perception and desire, not just as such. It needs a reason. Okay, so this is one view where you can still maintain this difference between, humans and non-humans. Okay, but there are some problems for this account. Look, the problems come from a couple of different places, but when you take this view very seriously, there are certain groups of non-human animals that potentially should be included in this category, that actually do have some of that self-reflective ability. And also, and this is probably more problematic, as I said, there are groups of humans who don't fit into that category. So if you are basing your standard for moral consideration on these things, you risk cutting out people, humans, that we really don't want to cut out from our moral consideration. And I'm actually going to take it as a given that you don't want to cut these out. So you don't want to cut out disabled humans, especially severely intellectually disabled. You do not want to cut out children. You do not want to cut out, the elderly and infirm. So if you don't want to cut out those groups, then how can you justify holding this view of what it means to have a status of moral consideration? Now, most non-human animals are not currently granted personhood status. As I said, there are a couple of places in the world where they are. But there's a question of why certain groups of humans who don't meet these rather strict standards are included in that when, for instance, primates are not. And that's where the grey area is, right? this is where this argument breaks down, because we can't actually care about all humans this way. So there's 4 ways to answer the problem. The first is this: you say non-persons are morally considerable indirectly, right? And this was Kant's answer. He said, if a man shoots his dog because the animal is no longer capable of service, he does not fail in his duty to the dog, because the dog can't judge, but his act is inhuman, and it damages in himself that humanity which it is his duty to show towards mankind. If he is not to stifle his human feelings, he must practice kindness towards animals, for he who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealings with men and humans, basically. So this view, he's saying the reason we should care about non-human animals is because we care about ourselves. And people who harm non-human animals are not good people. And we want to be good people. Also, people who harm non-human animals are more likely to harm other humans. And we don't want that to happen. So that's one way you can answer it. It's indirect. I'm not sold on it personally, but you can go for that. The second is to look for similarities between humans and non-humans. This is a kind of animal rights view, and if you're interested in this kind of way of thinking, I'd suggest reading some of Tom Reagan's work. He's an animal rights proponent. And Reagan argues that what's important for moral consideration is not the differences between humans and non-humans, but the similarities. And he argues that because persons share with certain non-persons, which includes those humans and non-humans who have a certain level of organized cognitive function, the ability to be experiencing an experiencing subject of life, and to have an individual welfare that matters to them regardless of what others might think, those both deserve moral consideration. So if you can want or prefer things, if you believe and feel things, if you can recall and expect things, then all of those things, including the ability to have pleasure or pain, or experience pleasure or pain, or enjoyment or suffering, or satisfaction and frustration, or a continued life or death, those all make a difference to the quality of life. And the same is true for non-human animals as for human animals. So we must say that these are all things that we look at and compare and say these are similar. Therefore, there's a certain amount of rights that any being who is able to experience any of these things is conferred. That's the view. Okay. But you may not like the idea of rights because they are very all or nothing. If you have rights, you have to uphold those rights, and you have to be conferred those rights, positive rights and negative rights. So people have to do things for you or not do things to you, and there's no way to get around them, and they often clash with each other. So if you're into rights, that's the view for you. The third is that you could say there are needs and desires beyond rationality that should be considered. And actually, this is a view that comes from Kosgard. As I said, she's a deontologist. So this view says there's a big difference, like as she argued, between this normative rational capacity and between that and not having that. So if humans have this normative reflective capacity, that's what makes them worthy of moral consideration. But if other beings don't have it, you can still confer on them some moral duty, but that duty is determined by what the object of the moral consideration is capable of, right? So this means, look, if you have a non-human animal who's able to experience pain, and we know pain is a negative thing, then you shouldn't place that non-human animal in undue pain, right? But you don't confer them anything more than that. It's only because they have the capacity to experience pain that we confer that as a moral kind of consideration. So, because that comes from our animal nature, not our rational nature, avoidance of pain is a base level thing. Okay. So, what we then become, it becomes a kind of take each case as it is type of situation, in which case, you know, your obligations to others are determined by what they're able to experience. Okay. Now, there is a fourth way. And the fourth way uses utilitarian ethics. And it says, are we asking the right question here? So we're asking about, can animals think? Can they rationalize? Can they have this normative reflexivity? Well, why don't we just reject that? We reject rationality as the relevant feature for a moral consideration. And you remember that utilitarianism is about maximizing utility, whether that utility is happiness or well-being or suffering. So the question becomes, are non-human animals sentient as opposed to conscious? Are they able to experience things? It's kind of similar to what Cosgard's asking, but she says, okay, and then you're limited in that way. Utilitarians don't have that kind of limit to your moral consideration. They're just saying, is it possible for non-human animals to experience, to be sentient or to be aware, right? Now, this is a very long quote. I'm just going to pull out the bits that matter. This is from Jeremy Bentham. And this kind of argument really is formative in utilitarianism. It's one of the base kind of arguments. And it was made very early on. It says, he's writing about how other animals, and he means non-human animals, haven't been granted any kind of moral consideration. And he says, the day may come when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights which never could have been withholden from them but by the hand of tyranny. He was very against the use of animals in this kind of way and the disregard for the needs of animals. And he then compares it to how we used to treat people of color, or at least Europeans used to treat people of color, and saying, you know, we realized that there was no difference between us and that we were all of the same race. And why did we do that? We did it because we understood that sentient beings are something we should care about. So he says, what else should trace that inseparable line, and he means the line between moral consideration and not? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? You know, do we have to look for those things? No, he says. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And that's what we're talking about. Okay. So one of the main kind of linchpins of a utilitarian argument when it comes to non-human animals is to do with dissolving the line between humans and non-human animals. In Kantian ethics in particular, you've got this strong line that there's something that distinguishes human animals from non-human animals in a morally relevant way. Now, utilitarians argue, and it's not all of them, but many do, and certainly Peter Singer does. And I encourage you to read some of his work on this. You did have a reading, but you can read further than that. He argues that, as with other forms of discrimination, speciesism, so having an attitude towards other species which is discriminatory just on the basis of them being part of another species, draws an arbitrary line between two groups. And that line is drawn on the basis of morally irrelevant physical features. He argues that species membership has no moral significance. So you just dissolve that line altogether, and what you're looking for is sentience. Can they suffer? Can they feel pleasure? Those sorts of things, very base level things. For preference utilitarianism, speciesism violates the principle of equal consideration of interests, because in preference utilitarianism, we're interested in any being that can have a preference, right? So, and we have to consider those preferences equally. No one has a kind of a status that's higher than anybody else. And in this sense, no species has a status that's higher than anyone else. I've included here a couple of links to some YouTube talks with Peter Singer. They're long, but I do encourage you to listen. They're like podcasts, but they're on YouTube. And he goes through in detail why you might want to be swayed by this argument against speciesism. So you have a couple of options now. You can go the very strong Kantian way. You can argue for animal rights. You can modify deontology in order to extend to what beings are able to experience, or you can embrace utilitarianism. And look, utilitarianism doesn't necessarily say, therefore we must treat non-human animals in exactly the same way as we treat humans. It doesn't do that. It's just blurring that line and saying there's no reason to have a line there. Okay, this is a picture of a beagle who was rescued from science research, which is quite horrible. This is the puppy. What a cutie. All right. Okay, so where to from there? How do you decide between these views? Well, animal rights, as I said, is an all or nothing view, right? And this is a quote from Tom Reagan. It's, animals are treated routinely, systematically, as if their value were reducible to their usefulness to others. They are routinely, systematically treated with a lack of respect, and thus are their rights routinely, systematically violated. It's an all or nothing view. You can't use animals. You can't treat them that way because they have rights, right? So according to the view that an animal's moral claim is equivalent to a moral right, any action that fails to treat the animal as being of inherent worth would violate that animal's right, and therefore it's morally objectionable. So in this view, any being that is the subject of a life has an inherent worth, and the rights that protect such worth, and all subjects of a life have these rights equally. So if non-human animals have a right to life in the way that we might think we have a right to life, then there's a lot that would need to change in science. And that would mean that those rights trump the rights of the animals that us as animals who may have a preference or something for eating animals or hunting animals or experimenting on animals and so forth. So all of that is wrong in this view, and a lot of animal activists are animal rights people. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, and I'll be transparent here and say that this is more my view. Utilitarianism allows for this contextual reflexivity. So it's about the context. It's about the specifics of any situation. It's not about these kind of all or nothing rules. So the utilitarian position on animals, as I said, commonly associated with Peter Singer, sometimes called an animal rights position, but it's not an animal rights position, says that the moral significance of the claims of animals depends on what other morally significant claims might be in play in any given situation. While the equal interests of morally considerable beings are considered equally, the practices in question may end up violating or frustrating some interests, but they wouldn't be considered morally wrong when everything's considered. Okay, so importantly, this is not an argument for any kind of practice in an all or nothing way, right? So, for instance, we might think that vegetarianism is something you would argue for in utilitarian views, and that is the case. But utilitarians would argue against the consumption of non-human animals and their secretions, except when it is absolutely necessary, say a medical situation or a particular social context. And they mean extreme. So they mean, you know, if you're Inuit and you live in an icy region, you may not be able to have essentially a vegan diet. But if you're in Australia, in Sydney right now, and all things being equal medically, you should be doing that, right? That's the utilitarian way of arguing. However, that view does miss some important intuitions about the wrongness of killing that animal rights seems to get at. So it really is up to you which of those two you are more swayed by. I think I'm going to use the utilitarian argument because it does present a more moderate view when it comes to research in science. But if you agree with an animal rights view, you probably need to take an all or nothing approach to research in science. And these arguments that I'm going to present still hold, but you have to take a stronger view on it. Okay. So in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to talk about this case study, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it in my next lecture. Firstly, this is a mythological creature, a chimera or chimera, depending on who says it. A chimera is where ethics gets even more grey. So it's a mythological creature. Okay, that's not going to pose us any ethical problems. But it's also a single organism composed of cells from different zygotes, right? So we can have created non-human animals which are partly mice and partly rats. Okay, so they have cells from both of these animals. It can result in all sorts of interesting things that happen when we do this kind of stuff, but it's also used in the context of organ transplantation, and I'm going to talk about xenotransplantation tomorrow. But really, the point of developing chimeras is to create organisms that can be used for one or the other of the species that you're putting together, right? Which makes sense if you're thinking about, say, using primates and having human cells in primates to develop, to grow parts for humans. If you think that there is a different kind of moral status of the two beings, you might want to use something that you think has a lower moral status. Obviously, you might not agree with that. Okay, so this raises questions about actually what it means to be a member of a species. And I've got, if you want the reference for this paper, this is a paper that explores these ideas specifically. It says, at present, the prevailing view appears to be that species identity is fixed and that species boundaries are inappropriate objects of human transgression. But this idea is actually an odd one. It's not the case that this species boundary is fixed. And in fact, we do all sorts of things to create plant-to-plant and animal-to-animal hybrids all the time. And that actually happens in nature all the time. That is the process of evolution as well as breeding. So we don't have that same kind of vehement response to creating combinations of, say, roses as we do to combinations that involve human beings. And the kind of premise of this paper is that, in practical terms, in theoretical terms, at least for humans, it appears that the only species whose identity is generally deemed genuinely fixed is the human species. But why? Why are we so protective of our identity? Is there some kind of social, political, or moral imperative to defend our boundaries so vehemently? And they start to think about, why is there this relationship between non-human animals and human animals, which seems to be a kind of non-permeable boundary. And this is a quote from one of the readings I gave you today. It says, fundamentally, it is the social relations between animals, humans, non-humans, and others betwixt and between that ensue from a breach of the species barrier that will produce a situation in which the issue of animal rights will take on profound significance. And what she's talking about is when we do create these chimeras, we start to have to answer some very difficult questions about what it means to be a member of a species and why we have these boundaries. So it's the utilitarian thing, right? It's blurring this boundary between non-human animals and human animals, which exists primarily for these kind of political, potentially scientific, but certainly moral reasons only. The final quote I have here is, moral confusions aside, what if we do if somebody in fact makes a human-animal hybrid, say a hybrid between a human and a chimpanzee, what then happens? It should be what then happens. What do we do, right? So if you make these hybrids with humans, are they partly human? Do they somehow magically get this moral consideration that's only given to human animals? Or do we treat them differently because they're partly a member of another species? Very difficult territory. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next lecture. So my conclusions for this lecture are that beings are worthy of moral consideration when they have a moral claim that the being has on those who are subject to such a claim, right? So we've got, if you want to have moral consideration towards non-human animals, they have to have some kind of claim on humans in order to have that claim. Now, it's often thought that humans are the only beings that can have such claims, but justifying that is difficult, and it's ultimately quite problematic. And so my conclusion is, in fact, that non-human animals are worthy of moral consideration, but how we understand that depends on our preference for ethical framework and our knowledge of the relevant capacities of non-human animals. So, for instance, in the octopus case, until fairly recently, we didn't understand how their consciousness worked. And so we kind of had a free-for-all in terms of octopus-related research. And now there's a hesitation in that area now that we more fully understand. So there's a kind of limit on it based on what we know. And as a result, there are implications for this view which directly affect the limits of scientific research. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next lecture. So thank you. Hope you enjoyed that.